Chapter 2. The Catch. So links had been forged, and now, a year later, the boys would together begin their payment for the incident at Simon's Pass. The day was well bit into and far from release. Hunter Jeffrey had to be back at sundown, so they would collect their things and meet at the opening of the woods nearest town. From there they would proceed to their favorite spot. Hopefully the grouse would also decide to meet there. It was a stretch of thicket scarcely 200 yards from the inner clearing of Simon's Pass. This patch now held a dubious new meaning. It was a stone's throw from where Jeff and Will had shot the bird-chasing Bill Noons that fateful day some weeks ago. They decided in advance to keep clear from that area, but they both knew they would not, at least not indefinitely. Will always loved the woods at this time of day, the late afternoon, before the twilight, when things changed. Leading the advance, he followed his instincts and his tracking skills in search of noon's next meal. Scarcely 10 minutes inside, they heard a rustling up ahead. Their rifles were primed, as were they. The men of war had found their quarry. Will cocked his head onto the stock of his rifle, closed his left eye, and squinted his right. No words needed to be spoken. They each knew the way the other worked and what needed to be done. There is a tongue-and-groove dynamic between both friend and foe that just sort of falls into place. Jeff and Will were like opposites from two distant lands, but as equal misfits to the surroundings, they were in perfect accord. Jeff picked an egg-sized rock from his feet and thrust it at the bush 20 paces ahead. The rock plummeted into the thicket, sure enough to scare the creature. Aimed just above the bush, Will's trigger finger could no longer hold back, and the gun let loose a blast. Moments later, the smoke having cleared, they raced to the bush and found no bird, though they had trimmed the hedge. Just as they turned away, again the rustling sound began. Frightened but unaffected, out scampered their grouse, disguised in long floppy ears and a white fur coat. The boys laughed and let him be. Serving man better as pets than with potatoes, Jeff had once explained to Will how hares are unfit to eat, subject as they are to loathsome diseases. In fact, Jeff had explained a great many things to Will, untaught by either parent or clergy. His friend was in many ways more of a teacher than the host of adults he had thus far encountered in his young life. The boys cuffed each other on the shoulder and reloaded the rifle. By the time the sun had begun to disappear behind a crest of pines that day, they had bagged 3 grouse and several pocketfuls of chestnuts. Feeling full of vinegar with rifles and birds slung over their shoulders, the great hunters approached the path leading back home. If in nothing else, Will knew himself to be a successful frontiersman. It was true. God's green wilderness did smile down on him. That summer had arrived like any other, in hopeful warmth and lingered lengths of light. It would leave as though it had somewhere else to be, and was late at that. Leaves had tanned yellow to red, and folks were appearing here and there in like-colored woolen jackets and caps. All over the community, people smelled, particularly of mothballs. Will loved the fall season. Most people did. Everything around seemed to smile and become just a touch more beautiful. Even the air felt more relaxed and at ease, enjoying a deep breath between the heaviness of heat and the harshness of hoar-frost. School was in. The boys had, despite a shaky start, managed to attain the required quota of cooking birds. Well-fed and justly satisfied, Magistrate Hodgkins had kept off their backs and out of their hair. Eager for that, their parents had let them be. Yes, shooting Bill Noons was one of the best things to have happened to them all year. Will mused that they should do it more often. All was well with the world, yet questions still remained. Something niggled at the boys that summer. If anyone is unlikely to let sleeping dogs lie, it's a boy, or a couple of them. On more than one occasion, they had journeyed within sight of Bill Noon's cabin and had seen him just sitting on his porch, tense and wooden like a carving of a man with a shotgun decidedly laying across his lap. He was neither a pacifist nor an activist, just armed and disinterested in conversations with strangers. Some folks said he had a moonshine still. Others questioned at his having clientele. He hung no shingle nor acted like a businessman. As distasteful as he was not false. A man cannot be both open-palmed and underhanded. If he was a wretched troll, he at least was a genuinely wretched one, and the boys secretly admired that about him. He did surely not wash behind his ears, nor pick his socks from the floor to please a darned soul. Oh, what a life of honesty! So many men go through their days being unlike what they are through their nights. Noons was always miserable, and in that he was happy, so they surmised. In the world at large, Will had noticed how workmen scrape for their bosses. Those soot-filled bosses scrape for their wives, and the wives step to the opinion of each other over sugary tea and talk. And that was the problem with the world. Everyone they knew, in one way or another, wanted their lives wrapped in syrup. Yep, it's better to stay salty, Will reasoned. Will did not seek the praise and flattery of men, nor the little cheeky pinches of the ladies. He just wanted his own boat and a kind stream to float him to a new world. Were there ever good old days, he wondered, or just gone old days that must have been better than now? With the necessities of chores and school, the boys would see less of each other in the coming weeks. Their differing education and background made their respective opposites of town painfully obvious. They were of different cultures that did not meet on a path back home. But a pal is a rare commodity, and only found when truth outweighs convenience and salt outseasons sugar. Also, secretly, Will literally ached to catch a glimpse or a single word in passing through a doorway or by a porch swing from a girl he dared love. She didn't know it. Even her brother hadn't a clue. Still, Will harbored both a longing for and a sadness over the object of his desire. He had kept the memory of her soft voice folded like a note and carefully pocketed in his heart, where he knew not how to win hers. Leah was so far away, across the river and another world. It may as well have been across an ocean. Some weeks ago, on the smooth flesh of an old birch tree in the woods, near where he had found the sloop, he carved her name. He scratched their initials alongside each other, stopped, looked back over his shoulder, and, assured of privacy, traced a heart around them both. He breathed deeply once, and then came back to reason and slowly closed his jackknife. "Why is it," he asked the sky, "that the things you want the most are the farthest away and the most unlikely?" He strained to remember things Uncle Des had told him a lifetime ago. What else did his uncle know? What could Des have taught that he had not the time to? Will remembered the scarlet threaded handkerchief and its inner treasure. What was all that about? Where was it now? Probably, Will concluded, the man and his secrets had been buried together, and the world soon forgets what it no longer sees. Things were different for Will. He only remembered those things out of sight, and sought what is irresistibly out of reach. All too terribly within reach was the schoolmarm, slamming her rod of correction on Will's desktop. William suddenly came back into the room, and the class of children laughed in unison. Children take an openly fiendish delight in the suffering and embarrassment of others. In adults, such pleasure is carefully hidden. The event reminded him of hyenas as they had been described in grim little storybooks. Boys and girls at birth, essentially, are pack animals, having only to adopt their pack parents' teachings. "Mr. Templeton," the instructor shrieked, "I trust you are with us this morning. You will allow us to spend time in your esteemed presence." Eyes were alit and grins were unsuppressed. Now here was just the thing Will despised, the setup. Regardless of whether he answered yes or no to that question, he'd be in for more trouble. He thought for a moment and replied, "I am very sorry for daydreaming, ma'am, and I promise to pay attention to you and the rest of the class members." That really elicited a scowl from the marm, being a reply for which he could receive no further humiliation. She disliked being bested by a child, and despised Will because he knew how not to lose in a no-win situation. Will's great-uncle had once taught him how not to become uprooted by the actions of others. "Whatever people might do," explained Desmond, "whether pleasant or cruel, is likely not about you, son, but rather just a reflection of themselves. Every human person has a journey to travel in this here life, and I know it seems like some only get a few inches. Never mind them. Will, your job is to keep your own feet true and tall wherever you're standing, then walk on." In Will's impression of the world to date, there were those who suffer and those who cause suffering. In a harumph, the marm turned back to her white chalk, black board, and narrow mind. The class proceeded. He did not do well in school, not in ways that would please others above his own conscience, but numbers counted for themselves, and examinations were passed to where a score could not be interpreted or opinioned by powers that ought not to be. Miss Steckley, the school-marm, was as warm-hearted and fuzzy as any common porcupine. Perhaps her tense nature was to blame for her indisposition, as it was rumored, from something called constipation. Even her hair seemed tight. It was pulled back from her face and forcibly tied in a permanent knot that could anchor a sea vessel. She frightened birds when standing outdoors. At any given moment she seemed, in Will's observation, to have most recently eaten a lemon or unripe persimmon, which would account for her expression being so tight-lipped even when smiling. As a spinster, she may have been trying, it was assumed, to prevent the wrinkles that come with ease and affability. In any event, no amount of apples would make Will the class pet. He was to learn patience, reliance on self, and the intrinsic value of marriage for young women. A woman, he surmised, needed an outlet for her fury, and one lone, able-bodied man was better suited than 30 captive, unarmed children. Less damage results. His own mother, on the other hand, had entwined with his father when she was but 17 years and fair. She had since become a lovely old woman of 42. Mrs. Templeton appeared content in her compliance and completely free to cook, bake, or sew. Then there was always laundering. His father had returned home from the shop on occasion with some awful blotchy blood stains on his crisp white coat. Bloodletting was standard duty of any competent barber, where the customer required it. Edward Clive Templeton was part medicine man, part beautifier, and frequently came home looking like the meat man. His wife was well accustomed and wonderfully competent at relieving his coat of customers' drippings. A letting and a laudanum later, Mr. Templeton relieved the pressure of many a businessman. Plus, they always emerged well-groomed, sheared, and clean-shaven. All in all, Will's parents each provided an essential service to the community, and the community provided the essential service to the state of just being there when needed in times of war and peace for sons and sums. William likened the world to a garden. Some plants get picked, some grow wild, and some just set there and go all to seed. And on it goes. Will still wasn't sure where he fit into the good dark earth, or what kind of plant he was to be. He was determined, though, to get a lot of sun and drink as much cool rainwater, or perhaps lemonade, as possible. Just then he could sense the stick striking down again, and came back into the room before it headed his way. He would surely try to pay attention, but the pull of counting pecks and bushels on a slate board was not quite as meaningful as just climbing the tree himself and shaking the apples into a waiting basket while sampling a sweet, crunchy one. He was a doer, not a sitter. When at last the class had ended, he was off to his father's shop for the sweeping of whiskers and the dunking of combs into a frightful blue solution. He quite enjoyed being around the grown-up men of all types. Some did all the talking, boasting, cigar puffing, and storytelling. Others were quiet about it all. They would just sit there and gaze off into the mirror. They were the ones who secretly had the most to say, and Will instinctively knew it. They were the most interesting to him. The back-slappers and guffawers were transparent. They pretty much emptied their heads with each cut. As for Will, he loved the sweep and sway of his willowy lion's mane. After the shop, he'd return home to his favorite spot on the soft grass down by the stream, under the willow's weepy branches. The autumn breeze ran through the long leafy hair suspended over a patch of green and a boy. Shadows and streams of light danced on his face. Sleep would have come easily to him, if only for a few lazy moments. The nearness of the tree, the river at his feet, and his unrequited love on the other side, across the universe, was all that he wanted, and all that he could not have. He knew his chores and his mother would be waiting. Will knew what it was to wait, and would not prolong hers. Mornings cometh with little fanfare, save that of the sun and the elements. There are routines and expectations common to all. Will needed no wake-up call, no rise and shine through the halls. He had his own system. He needed only tell himself the night before when he wanted to awake, and he would. Alas, awakened does not necessarily mean arisen, and therein lies the rub. His system was at least half perfected. In due time, he would join the day's beginning, and his bare feet would meet the cool wooden floor. He did not resent nor shrink from toil. He just instinctively knew that there must always exist a better way and a smoother, smarter path than the uphill one. He had ideas on how to simplify and improve things, but a boy's voice is lost among the routine of a daily grind. In this land of spectacled, waistcoated gentlemen, the man in the street is apt to have his opinion on everything from rice to race, none of which matter much to the men in the shadows above the street and the clang of industry. But Will cared less for the running of the state than he did for the chicken run, where he gathered eggs and avoided a rooster of decided ire. The remains of a farm belonging to his remaining grandparent was the change so often referred to as being as good as a rest. He'd spend weekends with his Grammy Fredericks and help her where he could. His mother's mother stubbornly refused to sell the farm she and her late husband Jacob had raised from the dust of the earth. They had also given rise to 8 children, one of whom was destined to wed the town barber in a town that needed barbering. Twin Forks had grown to become a lovely little garden spot, but did need some trimming around the edges. The world was sadly now losing its need for pioneers and explorers. Like a teenager, imagining she was already full grown, the young country was beginning to believe its own pride. But all the church socialites and all the king's men cannot of themselves reform a single hair on a single man's head nor chin. No matter how tightly one might squeeze, an unripe, unready grape cannot be made to squirt sweetly. Yet they who overlook the vineyard will try. And so the day was set for the church picnic. Take 112 parishioners of one ethnicity, one religion, one citizenship, and 112 differing opinions, thickly sliced, add liberal amounts of dead and fried chicken, salads of slaw and severed potatoes, so many potatoes, dozens of loaves, no fishes, gallons of root beer, soda pop, lemonade, and smuggled alcoholic beverages. Next, stir in a roster of contrived games, many of which involve potato sacks and potatoes themselves. Add a sprinkling of fervent indoctrination. Bake in the sun for 3 hours and see the glory that was Rome. Everyone with an appetite was there. Close neighbors, distant kin, and unknown elements. Bert Greevy, the local squash and turnip farmer, was seen trying his aim with the other men at the horseshoe pit. There were plenty of wide gestures, legs slapping and laughing to go around. Their wives were assembled elsewhere. Miss Janie Caroline, or Cotton, as she was called, was observed to be absorbed in a sort of arrhythmic slurping of an undisclosed beverage near the lemonade bowl. Miss Cotton Caroline, neither quite insane nor totally unaffected, lived off a modest income of rabbit farming on her great-grandfather's plantation, passed down to her from the time of the Great War between the states. Apart from the schoolmarm, Miss Caroline was one of only 2 local spinsters. Regarding this, she did, however, not seem to notice. Life always appeared to offer the best of times to some and the worst of times to others. Will had heard a phrase like that before, and often returned to it in his thoughts, for it so summed up the feelings in his heart of late. The world of Twin Forks, it seemed, was run by potatoes. He knew not why nor how they attained their ascendancy over the land of upright walking creatures, yet Mr. and Mrs. Potato were on the lips and beards of everyone present, excluding the girls, of course, for they had no beards, most of them, but he had seen their lips and took note of them for further study at a later date. for better, or something worse, were the lips of one Wilhelmina Tomlinson. Since she and Will had such similar names, she reasoned, they should get married. Future hand towels with little monograms in the corner would service the couple equally. Will had other perspectives. It was not that she was a bad girl, thought Will, but, well, just not his type. Her teeth preceded her mouth, and her light blonde ponytail, recently advanced from pigtails, was oft well darkened from inkwells and dippage. Neither was she a dumb girl, just simpler than the pretty ones, who were more developed in the sorcery of scheme. Like William, Wilhelmina was something of an outsider, having never lived down the time she wet herself in class. Will reckoned she'd eventually end up with a pudgy banker boy and live on china plates and finger sandwiches. At least he hoped so. As it was, though, she was sweet on Will. At every opportunity she'd send a little finger wave in his direction, along with that ever forward-leaning smile. The church picnic was the perfect opportunity for her to make her move. From her mother's blanket she slipped away, wide-brimmed bobbing bonnet, Sunday dress and all. In yellow and white she looked like a large frilly daisy darting across the lawn. As the crow flies, with the unstoppableness of a 13-year-old girl on a mission, her incisors and bonnet led the way directly to young Mr. Templeton. He was reclining, as he was wont to do, under a tree in speckled sun and shade, 'neath leafy branches and a clear blue ocean of sky. Shy she was not. "Hello, Will!" she exclaimed, as she stood at his feet, swaying back and forth in rhythm with the tall branches overhead. He cracked open one eyelid, then closed it. Yes, Eve had found his sweet sanctuary, and Will knew if she had her way, they'd soon both be expelled from Eden. "I've been looking for you," she said, just before another sway and show of teeth. "Gee, that looks comfortable down there under the tree. I want to try it too." Down she plopped, inches away from him, unchaperoned and unrestrained. "See, isn't my hair pretty? Do you like it like this, Will?" She tipped her bonnet to reveal the ponytail that had become ringlets at either side of her face. Her eyebrows were raised in an expression of expectation. Without missing a beat, she added, "And my mamma rinsed my hair with fresh chamomile flowers just last night. It's so soft. You can touch it if you want to." Ah, the turn of the screw. She had pulled out all the stops this fine, ripe Sunday afternoon. Perhaps she had already written the day's events in her diary, kept locked and dreamt on nightly under her right pillow. This was a girl with drive and intention. Perhaps she would become the pudgy banker herself. By hook or by crook, by hair of fair, she meant to steal her first kiss that afternoon, and not even her intended was going to stop her. Will had to think fast or run fast, either would do. Her eyebrows were starting to lower, and he instinctively knew that, heaven help him, he had better do something before they got too far down her forehead. He spoke. "Well, hi there, Wilhelmina. Gee, your hair does look nice, all balled up like that, like little handles." Will couldn't get the image of a teapot out of his mind. Tilting her head as she was, he was afraid something might spill out. Like a claw, his right hand on the ground beside him tensed up and dug into the dirt, clinging to as much earth as he could. He added, "I see you've gotten that fountain ink out of your tail, ponytail area." He then quite brilliantly reached around as if to touch her freshly flour-rinsed golden locks with his paw of mud. "Ugh!" she gasped in disgust. "Don't you dare touch my beautiful hair with that awful dirty hand of yours, Will Templeton. You're not a barber's son. You're a barbarian." Will marveled at how she seemed to not at any time have to pause for a breath. "I had a mind to let you kiss me, but I may just have to find another young man who's more of a gentleman, a well-groomed gentleman. You just think about that, Mr. Templeton, before I visit with you again." He most assuredly did, and ran his hand through his own hair for insurance. She stormed off, and he lay back down, head in hands, grinning up at the tree. Diaries would have to be amended, but the day was young, and the pilot light of a 13-year-old maiden needed but a hint of tinder and spark to blow up in someone's face, or so reckoned a 15-year-old boy. Why was she not, pondered Will, like other girls, all aflutter over horses and cake pans? Nonetheless, he would live to fight another day. He would choose the girl whose germs would first touch his mouth. And she was a million miles and years away. His grin dissipated, giving way to one deep, chest-filled sigh. He dared not mention her name aloud, even to himself, lest he jinx the whole thing. Only he and the trees would know. No diary or peeking eyes would see his heart of hearts. Yet one day he hoped it would be so. He thought of his Uncle Des. Will could have confided in him. Desmond knew the ebb and flow of tides and brides and maidens fair. "Will, when you observe a woman who is preoccupied with many clothes and the making up of her face, you must ask yourself one question. What is she trying to cover up? Likewise, ask of yourself, what exactly does a man search his life for, never recognizing it when he finds it? You're just a lad now, but as your years unfold, never come to say you don't need a woman." He looked up for a moment and added, "Neither, of course, should a woman think she is sufficient without a man, however unlikely a woman might say that. We don't know, Will, what we don't have. We cannot possibly know the thing we're missing, and we're all missing something." He then had Will place a ball of string on the top of his head and stretch a strand to the floor. "Now look at yourself in the mirror, my boy." What am I supposed to see?" The man quietly answered, "What don't you see, Will?" The boy was silent, then shook his head and answered, "Well, I don't see any horns." They both laughed. Desmond added, "Nor a halo, lad." They laughed again. "No," he then explained. "What you don't see is one of anything. Your body works in pairs. Each part has got a backup that works just as well as the other, but from another point of view. If need be, you could do without one aspect, and the other would still work. But here's the thing. You wouldn't be a whole man. No matter how hard one side might compensate, there's still a missing piece. And with that goes your whole balance. You could look inside yourself, and you'd see 2 lungs, 2 kidneys, uppers and lowers, rights and lefts, in your brain, your guts, your liver, and in your heart, young William. Tell me, can you walk with one leg? Can you climb with one arm? No, not without a helping partner. Listen to me, Will, because I've lived alone, and I can tell you this. I did it, but it's not right. Your dad never told you, but I was once engaged to be married." The aging man walked to his window and stopped. He seemed to become somehow lost there, then caught himself, having drifted, and turned, pulling himself back. He cleared his throat, breathed in once, then sharply let it go. "Anyway," he said, extending a smile, while his eyes seemed quite the opposite. "Anyway, Will, I haven't a son of my own, and I had hoped, with your permission, that I could teach you a thing or two of what I've come to learn in my travels. When I was young, I thought that understanding and even happiness, these things just came naturally with age and the progression of one's life. And when I aged, I took note of my friends and strangers and those who became strangers. He chuckled. Even my enemies. Well, I learned from them as much as any friend, maybe more. I left and I returned and I watched the lives of people, and I found that my belief was not so. I found that often wisdom does not just show up. It must be terribly earned. Most often will with mistakes and suffering. For your sake, I wish it were not so. I would wish life's many lessons to be easier, but that wish in itself would be unwise. He chuckled again. If there exists another way, perhaps you'll be the one to discover it. The man lingered there and seemed to search for the appropriately aged words. The boy then lifted his arm to his old uncle, and they both knew that explanations were not necessary. Unfair, however, were the roles and rules that held such a grip over the desires of Barbara's sons and river boys. Will sat for a long while under that oak tree, plucking blades of grass from the earth and tying knots in them. His mind was just as busy and no less knotted. Sometimes silence seems the only course that may be taken. He closed his eyes. What could Miss Leah Asher be doing right now? Had her thoughts ever turned to him? Did she even remember him beyond a passing glance in a doorway? Across the tide and tracks, above the lintel and door, on the second floor of the Asher household, Leah sat alone. In a darkened corner of her room, lit by a single candle atop a sparsely appointed, well-made oaken roll-top desk, her gaze was silently fixed. The tiny flame burned steadily, dutifully, wavering only now and then to the light movements of an ink pen when dipped into its reservoir, then returned to the paper. Her words were carefully chosen and graciously applied, with an emotion unsuccessfully hidden. She dotted the last period on the page, signed her name at the bottom, and delicately pursed her lips above the sheet. She softly blew a wisp of breath to dry the glistening words, then folded the page twice and slid it into its waiting envelope. Leah then unfolded a small piece of paper from a discreet pocket in the lap of her dress. She transcribed the secretly obtained address to the envelope face and watched it dry to permanence. To Mr. William Templeton, 118 Evans Street, West Twin Forks, Ohio, United States of America. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath.